Okay, we're going to get started. My name is Peter Young. I'm Yale College, 1974, Brantford, and I am going to be the moderator for this Yale career panel on a candid view of post-PhD non-academic careers. This is kind of an interesting one because this was actually one that was suggested by a number of Yale graduates who said, I know you tend to do these around architecture or consulting or legal or medical, but it'd be very, very helpful to many of us if you talked about the different career choices if you go through a PhD program and then decide not to continue on long-term in an academic career. In terms of the big picture, the Yale Career Panel started in April of 2012, and a group of us Yale alumni volunteers decided this would be very helpful for Yale students and Yale graduates to have a series of panels where essentially you have panelists sort of give a very even-handed, candid view of different professions. And the reason why was that the feeling was that many professions have myths that are either too sexy or not sexy enough or whatever it may be. And it gave a lot of the students and graduates a distorted view of what it was really like to be a lawyer or to be an architect or otherwise. So, I mean, a good example is so many people are going into forensic science because of NCIS, LA, New York, et cetera, and Bones, et cetera. And yet, if you ask someone who actually works in the forensic department in the New York Police Department, they'll tell you it's nowhere near as sexy as those shows where they have the touch screens and all sorts of high-tech stuff. And of course, everyone is beautiful. So there's an extreme example where TV and movies can really mislead you as to what the profession is all about. We've done, this is the 37th Yale Career Panel, and we've also done 5 Yale Career Fireside Chats around career issues, such as getting on boards or making major career changes, et cetera, that are not specific to a profession. This came up because there are a lot of people who said, look, if you get a doctorate, you can have a variety of different careers. You can go on and teach, you could do research at college universities, you could try to be a tenured professor. But then for a lot of people, along the way, they come to the realization at some point that they don't want to continue on an academic career path and have to figure out a new way forward. And some go through a difficult process of figuring it out. Others, it's quite easy. So the whole idea of this is to have 3 panelists with very diverse backgrounds, as you will learn, and as you learned from the invitation, who can talk about their own journey as they made decisions and ultimately took a non-academic career path at the end. So we have 5 questions that I'm going to lead this panel through, and then we want to make sure that there is plenty of time at the end for questions from all of you. There are 2 ways that you can ask questions. One way is the traditional chat function, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. You just click on that, type in a question, and we'll be able to see the question. The other is a Q&A function, which is fairly similar, where again you can ask a question, and I'll choose the questions and pose them to the panelists, and hopefully we'll be able to answer all of your questions. This is also being recorded, and the recording of this and all but 3 of the previous career panels and fireside chats are available at yalecareerpanels.com. Also, if you have any questions you might want or suggested career topics, or you just want to be on make sure you're on our emailing list, just email to yalecareerpanels@gmail.com. The last thing I want to say is that this is not just the effort of myself. We have a group of 4 volunteers who of different ages, different backgrounds, who together we figure out which topics and we organize these. And then we work very closely with Yale, the Yale Office of Career Strategies, the Yale Alumni Association, and a number of other Yale organizations to both get ideas, panelists, but also to promote these events. So with that, let me get started. And I think the first question here is, which I'll pose to all the panelists, and any of you or all of you can comment. So what are the different reasons for getting a doctorate, and what are the different career paths that are possible? So if you step back and think more broadly, not just your own situation, because all of you, you know, had classmates who were doctoral students, et cetera, et cetera. So you've probably been exposed to a lot of different decisions that people made. So again, what are the different reasons for getting a doctorate, and what are the different career paths that are possible?
I mind starting.
Okay, go ahead.
My PhD is in the life sciences in the Department of Cell Biology. And in the life sciences, that question is narrowed a little bit or specified by the specific topic areas that somebody worked in. So, you know, if your work was highly translational and related to understanding diseases, new mechanisms of disease, or developing therapeutics, then that opens a lot of careers that are down that same path, right? One thinks immediately of the pharma industry. So there's jobs there beyond as a scientist, but also like a medical science liaison, somebody who communicates scientific information to healthcare practitioners, whether they be MDs or pharmacists or nurse practitioners. Somebody who, when there's new data coming out for medications, is able to be a liaison between that data and somebody who's practicing clinical medicine. In life sciences, you also see people go into patent law sometimes, not always requiring a JD. Some people work, you know, below that level of a JD with a PhD in life sciences, working to help people communicate their science into the kind of language that is used in patents. So that's a couple that life sciences can go into. And then I specifically stayed with bench research as a scientist in industry, so focusing on making new medicines.
George or Jorge, whatever you wish to go by, you went partly, you know, spent a number of years in an academic career before you made the change and had a very interesting career. So any comments about that question, about the different paths you see among the people you've known?
Yeah, so I prepared some thoughts, and I'm going to speak to the thoughts I prepared. I think that the biggest area I would encourage people on this call to think about is the psychology of things, is like what you know, why you want to do things and why you might want to do things. So the question is a really good one. Is it why do people go get a PhD in the first place? Now, I'm in the soft part of the world, literature, and I'm pretty sure that most people would say, I got into it out of love for the material, right? And probably, if they thought more about it, because I had a really great teacher who kind of really activated. So, and what I think are really important is that a lot of this is about understanding your strengths as applied outside of the specific area that you're in, right? And so I think that passion and conviction and determination are super strengths, and a lot of it is really about kind of redirecting it and using that, recognizing and redirecting it into new areas. The natural or obvious or quote unquote easy transitions for people from literature would be, well, you can be a journalist, you could work in a library, you can, somehow directly correlated to what you did. I didn't do that. I went to a completely different area, right? And I now work for an investment company that invests in wireless infrastructure. So the question is, and I really, really believe that this is the question, is what can you reinvent or re-engineer, reshape yourself to do? And what is it that you love about that? So I love communicating. Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, one of the things I always say at the beginning of these things, and I should have, is that these panels can be very helpful in terms of getting good information and perspectives from the panelists. But the one thing it won't do, and I encourage everyone to do this, is to know yourself. What are you good at? What are you not good at realistically? And what do you love and really not don't love? And that one is a hard one, but I would strongly encourage everyone on this call to make sure you have a good and accurate assessment of yourself. And that's hard to do, right? Because none of us are very good at being objective about ourselves. And so whatever mechanism you do, whether it's a friend who knows you and well enough, but willing to be honest, that's important. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how much information you have about being an architect, lawyer, whatever. If you don't know yourself and you're not well matched with that, it still won't work. Lin Shu, do you have any comments on this overall different paths you've seen among colleagues and friends?
Yep. Just to echo on Peter's point, I think exactly like these decisions are really big decisions. If you think about what a PhD or a JD or MD really take, is a very complete bulk of time of your life at your 20s, most likely, that will be devoted to one thing. So you would necessarily need to think about what are the opportunity costs, right? If you spend like 5 or 6 years on this one topic, what are some alternatives that you can also spend the time on and potentially get a better outcome? So that's sort of that's just one example of the weighing of different opportunities that you do. And I'm saying that to just echo Peter's point that you should be driving that decision. And we're here to provide complementary information at the best to broaden your horizon of exploration. So for me, I was trained as a physicist. So reason for me to get a PhD is I didn't feel like I had enough of learning for my 4-year in college, because that pretty setting the foundation of the physics. I want to focus on something that can really bring an impact. And I chose to be a theorist because I wanted more freedom, essentially. So that's my self journey. And in terms of non-academia career paths, if you think about the relevance to sort of your core of expertise for like people like me who are doing quantum computing, you can go to IBM, Microsoft, Google. They are all now having some piloting effort in terms of exploring these cutting edge technologies. So those are the closest to academic. Those are essentially the same as academic versus probably the only difference is you're in a corporate development with some different mandate of driving some profit in the 5 or 10-year long-term future. And then if you think down the line, if you want to be more transferable in terms of those skills, a lot of my peers go to do quantitative analysis either in the bank or for other tech firms that can really use the analytical skills. And for me, I choose to do consulting, which is probably even a further step away from academic research. Is really based on my personal interest of different business aspects, and it's merely personal interest driven, and also love that people interaction factor of that.
Yeah.
Yep.
So the next question I have here, actually, Levi, won't be good for you because it doesn't apply to your situation, but you still may want to comment. And that is, in the case of both Lin Shu and Jorge, you came to a point where you decided not to continue in an academic career, and then had to go through a decision of, okay, what next? Maybe if each of you can take 1 or 2 minutes to just say, what was that moment where you suddenly said, something, this is not where I should be, and then how'd you come to the conclusion where you wanted to end up? And in both cases, you're doing things that are radically different from what your doctorate would necessarily, dictate, at least relative to what you're doing now, right? So either one of you, if you could comment. And the only reason why Levi is because he went into it knowing he was going to go into biotech and so forth. So the question doesn't apply to you, right?
Yeah, I'll go first this time. So probably has changed a little bit now, but it was really rare, very rare for anybody in my PhD program to think about, certainly not talk about, not wanting to become a university professor. I mean, that was just absolutely the expectation. So there was no discussion, nothing like what's going on right now. And I very unusually got my PhD and taught, and it was only after teaching for 6 years and then not getting tenure that I made the decision, well, do I want to now take the next steps that one takes at this point or make a big break? So
You could have continued teaching, right? So it wasn't
oh, absolutely.
tenure. It wasn't the
Absolutely.
tenure alone. On it, you could have continued teaching if you wanted to, right?
Absolutely. And that was very much the expectation all the way around. I just used that point, right, as a crossroads to just kind of reconsider everything about what I really wanted. And I made a pretty big break at that point. Told me that you should be talking to everybody you can possibly talk to get that other perspective and input from other people, and especially people who were not in academia. And so I started this chain of this person said you should talk to these 3 people, and those 3 people said you should talk to these 3 people. And I really went through a rigorous process of getting this kind of information, which had not been part of my world at all, right? And
that helped you. And that helped you make the decision to which direction to head, right?
Right. And so I'll just say very quickly, it came out that people were basically saying there's 3 areas that somebody like you will find amenable to you. One of them is consulting, right? So especially the ones that really reach out for, high power PhD types like McKinsey and, so on. And so
not McKinsey.
The other would be not McKinsey. Yeah. They like PhD students. They love Yale PhD students, and they're accustomed to you. And the more you know about how they think, the happier everybody's going to be. If that's the right path for you. The other was to be an equity analyst because of the research component, and the other one people said a lot at the time is look for startups, because they're just looking for sort of utility players, people who can do anything and will do anything and get the experience. That they said the fastest way for you to catch up with the people who've been doing this for 10 or 15 years, go to a startup. And that's what I did, and it was the right path for me.
Lin Shu, any comment on that? Again, the decision, right, to shift?
Yeah. Like one of my, I'll say, principle of life is to regularly examine, am I in a position or do I see myself on the current path towards the top 10% of like the people I work with? And probably 2 or 3 years into PhD, especially among my theoristic peers, many of them like are physics Olympiad award recipients. So I realized how talented they are in terms of theoretical physics, and I think like given the runway, I can probably do an okay job, but probably not a superb job. So then that sort of pushed me to think about where are other areas I can potentially excel with like which are combined with my interests, right? That's the push part. And the pull part is I happen to have 2 mentors, I call them, who I constantly talk to, who are both like consultants. They're already exited consulting, doing something else, but they both excelled after that and benefit a huge ton from the consulting experience at their early tenure. So that sort of is a pool for me to really think about consulting as the alternative sort of path.
Yeah. So the next question is actually perfect for Levi, right? So now we're going to go to one that Levi is the right first person to respond. And that is, although we're talking about shifting from a PhD graduate school track and so forth into there are actually some professions where a PhD degree is either heavily preferred or required. And so that's the next question. And I guess, Levi, you're in exactly that, right? Because actually, if you go to a typical biotech company or a high tech company, the vast majority, many of the people are PhDs because that's an important requirement for doing well. You want to comment on that, because actually that's one area, also particularly Yale, right, has a huge amount of activity in areas where that is true. Maybe you can comment on that, right? And then we can go on to our other panelists.
Absolutely. In fact, the biotech that I'm with is a spin out from a Yale lab, from Craig Cruz's lab. So yes, if you want to be a scientist in industry, if you want to be leading programs in industry, you need to have a PhD. There are roles in biotech and pharma companies where you're still doing bench science that don't require a PhD. Those roles are more, typically those would be like a research associate, that kind of role. And those are more running protocols and being a part of the pipeline that really generates information and helps move programs forward, which are absolutely essential to the team. But if you want to be a part of the leadership, if you want to be a part of directing what's the next experiment we're going to do, what's the right way to think about this program, what are the right experiments to execute to understand if our target is valid and if our intervention is efficacious, that requires a PhD. Or alternative, I mean, we do have one person at our company who he did his master's at Yale and exited before doing his PhD, but he's been in the industry for over a decade and has been able to slowly kind of progress to that role. But having a PhD, vast majority of the time is required, and certainly accelerates what you can do. And on that science side, there's certainly going to be a ceiling on the science track for somebody without a PhD. It's simply eventually going to be a requisite.
Yeah. I run an investment bank that focuses on life sciences and chemicals. In both of those industries, you go into their R&D units, and they're very, very heavily populated by PhDs, right? So that's true. Any comment, either Linshu or Jorge, on this topic of, what are, just think about career paths that you can think of where it was either preferred or a requirement to be a PhD.
Administration for educational administrators, by and large, that's a really powerful and important credential. If that's the kind of direction that you're interested in.
Yeah, I can probably also speak from the point of view of consulting and venture capital. So like for consulting, for example, like the McKinsey or Boston Consulting Group or Bain, they all have their targeted recruiting programs targeting at what we call like advanced degree candidates. I think partially the reason is at nowadays the consulting projects, some of them can be really involved, like the ones that are like life science or biotech related. Essentially, probably the client team is a full crew of PhDs. So you would find it weird if at the other end of the table you have a crew of different people from different backgrounds, and they can communicate well with each other. So that's one reason, and another reason is really like think about the PhD transferable skills at like the analytics and even the perseverance that you are able to accomplish something so cutting edge on some pressure or some setbacks over a course of a few years. That's some really amazing attribute that can shine in consulting as well. So we just want to point that too out.
I have one question that actually was not on the list of questions that I had on, but it occurred to me, the lifestyle and the whole process of being a graduate student, being a PhD and doing research, right, is actually somewhat different from many, many different professions, right? Even if you do research at a company. So actually, this is not on the list of questions, but the more I think about it, pretty much if you don't go and continue on and do research as a PhD and a doctorate, you're going to have a major change in what your work environment is like and so forth. I mean, so maybe the three of you can comment on that about, when you transition from being in more a research PhD kind of environment to the environment you're at. I think that's a change in lifestyle, work environment, so forth. Maybe people can comment. Levi, do you want to start out? Because even though you intended to go into biotech research, it probably felt very different as you went from what it was like when you were at Yale versus at the company you're at.
Sure, absolutely. So the one thing in biotech that I would say is the most different from academia is the value that's placed on your time. So doing our experiments in the most rigorous but quick, like high throughput manner, so running things through 384 well assays instead of one-off kind of experiments that you do a lot of in your PhD is a big difference. So because the grad student is often one of the most economical parts of research in graduate school, that emphasis on the value of the amount of hands-on time that you have is dramatically different in biotech. So that's one of the biggest differences that changes. I still think about my science pretty much around the clock, although I am not at the bench, not in the lab nearly as often as I was in graduate school. Certainly have a lot more time outside to have that work-life balance that actually becomes a thing once you graduate.
Yeah, and see, this is an issue that you have to think about rather explicitly. So, Jorge, I'm sure that as you transitioned from being a professor to being in finance, there was no change in lifestyle, right?
No.
The effort was totally the same. It was like easy as pie, right?
No, it was actually a jolt to my system, and I think most people in PhD programs do a lot of work on their own and their own schedule, own time, and so on, and like it. I have to like it somewhat because they're that's the basis of their life. So that changes completely, and I struggled feeling like I can't think with all these people asking me questions every 5 minutes about different things. I can't. So I've managed to take the strengths, right? Which I think that in general, PhD students are good at thinking about very complicated things, right? Thinking well about them. That's a great strength that you're going to bring to any possible situation that you're in. It could be your biggest asset. It's the independent, rigorous, consistent thinking. So I had to adjust to keep that strength while giving everybody that I'm working with, the collaborative environment, what they need. And so, that was a huge adjustment. But I think it's important to remember that you're bringing to the table some extraordinary skills, and you want to preserve that, right? So the more, again, back to know yourself, the more you know about how you best work, right? And when you best work. If mornings are the really great time for you and you can protect a couple hours in the morning before you get into the fray of like, where's this, where's that, what about this, that kind of crazy environment, then you can bring your strength and also give the organization what it needs because it's collaborative work.
But you really have to think through this issue. I'll give you a good example. When I was at Solomon Brothers, they brought in a very famous guy who worked in government. Actually, I won't mention names, but he ran OMB, so he did the entire the budget, U.S. budget, and was very famous. And John Goodfriend, who was running Solomon Brothers, brought him in, and after a year, it was a disaster. And why? Because in investment banking, you have to work on 5 or 6 things at the same time in order to be successful. And this guy only could work on one thing at a time, right? So it happened to be, when he was in government, it was a very large thing, but it was really on one thing, and really struggled because he, you give him one thing, he did it really well, but he could only do one thing at a time. So there's an example where if someone actually sat him down and said, let me tell you what it's like to be an investment banker, he might have been able to figure it out, right? But he didn't, and he really, really had to struggle. Lin Chu, any comment on this, the transition of lifestyle and team effort and the work environment?
Yeah, probably I would just quickly add 2 points to Jorge. So I think one is, for me, is probably similar boat as Jorge, that I had a pretty freestyle life when I was PhD. I was a theorist, so I essentially, do it whenever I want. Versus in consulting, it's like the opposite of the spectrum, where where I follow the meetings and have to be pretty cautious about the timeline. That's one thing. And the other thing I would say is really the team collaboration. So in my PhD, like I probably assume it's similar to others, you are in charge, you're driving your own project, and that you have the whole ownership of that, right? And you pull in different resources, you talk to your advisor, you talk to collaborators, and to get that down. In consulting, we have this iterative style of working every day, and we have to communicate extensively on different topics across the day with different stakeholders, right? Then that really is a contrast from my previous life, where you really can think it through, and you don't need to talk to anyone in a week if you don't want to. So that's a pretty opposite experience. So I would say, like, for these 2 points, probably potential solution is really to get your shoes wet, and get some internship experiences. For me, I interned with McKinsey first, then decided to rejoin. So that internship really gave me the taste of what day-to-day is like, and determine whether I would see myself in this job for a sustainable period of time, versus it's actually not the right thing for me. So I would probably bring that internship opportunity out, and knowing this is probably not easy for everybody, but if that's possible, you should just shoot for it.
If I could just add a little bit there. So, I'm going to keep focusing on it because it's super important, is try to look at things from the other side of the table. What do other people think of you when they encounter you, right? So when I'm hiring people who are PhD students, right, I want to know whether they can make that transition or not. I'm looking for any indication that they've actually tried to do it a different way. So, it's kind of a cliche, but get involved in organizations or activities that are not just about your research project, that show that you can get along with people and work with people, and it's not going to blow up, because there's a blow up risk for PhD type people, right? They might not be able to make the transition. So prepare yourself and prepare what you look like to other people by doing some of that.
One piece of advice I would give is, I don't know the name of this test, but when I was at Harvard Business School, they gave this very common occupational compatibility test. It's got a famous name, I know, but
Strengths Finder?
Pardon me?
Strengths Finder?
No, I don't know. It's like a preference, but I don't remember. But basically, you sat down and you answered like a couple hundreds of questions, but they had they had the same questions about lifestyle, about preferences, and so forth. And they had people in different professions, whether it's fireman or librarian, whatever, answer the same. And they tried to figure out whether your answers correlated heavily with the people in the different professions. And actually, it's a very good idea. And a lot of people who took it found it very useful, because it went into questions like lifestyle. Do you like to be outdoors? Do you have are you willing to work on something that takes 2 years to be finished? Things that actually are correlated with different professions. The only funny part of this story was that I took this test, and 2 weeks later, they called me and said, we got the results back. And I came in, they said, well, there's good news and bad news. I said, well, what's the good news? They said, you are unbelievably correlated with 2 professions, 98% or more, which is incredibly high. I said, well, what's the bad news? He said, the 2 professions are military officer and musician. So I said, well, then what should I do? He said, we don't know. That was the question we asked. We have no idea what you ought to do. So I said, well, obviously I should be a musician in the military band, right? So the next question, actually, Leva, do you have any comments on that issue about, matching up your, the transition, right? Any further comments on that?
I mean, for the transition to like what I'm doing as a scientist in a biotech, you have to have the specific skill set that is needed. So the PhD alone doesn't demonstrate enough. Like I mentioned in the first question, it really takes kind of a narrowing there. So you need to have done the techniques that a company needs so that you can come in and bring value to them. It doesn't mean you have to work on that exact topic, but since we're talking about, generating data and interpreting that data, you need to be familiar with what it looks like. Now, I've learned new techniques since I've joined our company, and that's part of the general skill set that a PhD brings, is that ability to learn new skills and to adapt to what is needed. But certainly, if you want to work in drug discovery, drug development, you need to groom your PhD around that to show that you've thought about science from the perspective of drug development and developing therapeutics.
Now, the good news is people are asking a lot of questions. We got 14 questions that people have typed in, so that's good. So what I'm going to do is there's one last question I'd like to pose to the panelists, and then we're going to switch over to the questions from the audience. So look, and this is slightly related to the previous question, but the mentality and general makeup of doctoral students and PhDs can be quite different certainly from people who just graduate from college, but also certainly very different than people who go into graduate schools such as business school or that are more trade oriented, nursing, so forth. And what do you see as those differences, and how can you make those attributes a plus rather than a minus when you pursue non-academic careers? So this is a question for any of the panelists.
Yep, I can probably share my quick thoughts first. So in terms of the transferable skills and really the distinction between us PhD candidates or PhD holders versus college grads versus people who are experienced hires or like people who have previous industry experiences. I think two things. So compared to college grads, really what I feel like, at least in consulting, what we bring to the table is really that inner peace and really the common sense that we have accumulated across the years in grad school, right? When you're communicating some important message, the message itself is pretty important, but also the way you communicate and how you understand where the other parties are coming from and have that common language is a very important skill and doesn't come granted. So I think I do see a lot of PhD students spike on that, on getting that channel open. And the other one is compared to probably MBA students or other business-oriented students. It's more like the analytical skills, like that's pretty obvious. And the other one is really to think about the problem-solving approach in consulting versus the research approach in your academic life. They're pretty alike, right? You have some hypothesis, you test it, you have some results, and you deep dive, and you have a better result or a deliverable. So the whole process is pretty similar. So to Levi's point, think about how you can transfer those important skills you have in grad school and apply that in the context of the job you want to apply to, and make the dots connected, right? And that make sure you do your homework, and I think that will really help you.
Yeah, and I think one comment I'll make is that since I've hired lots of people over the years, right? Either when I was at Bain in consulting, or I was in private equity or investment banking, the one thing that sort of is obvious is that a lot of the people who came from graduate schools, they tend to be like very smart, very good analytical, and they were high on the IQ, but not as high on the EQ, right? But not necessarily because they didn't have the innate ability, but it wasn't a big requirement, right? In their PhD program and so forth. And some people learned it quickly and raised their EQ, and that combination was awesome, right? Between the IQ and the EQ. And others just struggled because they just couldn't make that transition to working where you really had to focus a lot on interactions with other people and so forth in a different way than if you were in a graduate school. Levi, did you have any comment on this?
Yeah, and I actually have a little bit of firsthand experience here because I did train in one of those, professional programs before grad school. I trained as a pharmacist before coming and getting my PhD. And what I think Linshu started to hint on that I think is probably a universal commonality that is unique to PhDs is that comfortability with the unknown and filling in that unknown. So being comfortable having a discussion or talking about what something might look like or could look like or what the value of some new thing might be, getting a good sense of that and then going in and filling in those blanks, whether it's through talking to key opinion leaders or generating the data yourself. That ability to operate in a space that there's nothing filled in around you really, and it's up to you to go and figure out what that can or should look like.
Interesting, very, very interesting point. Jorge, any comment?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say on this, but I had prepared 3 points, right? And the first one was always have 3 points, right? And it's a joke, but it's my experience of academics, especially the further you get in. It's kind of like the dummy curve. When you don't know, right, you don't talk. As the more you know, the more you talk, right? But talking too much tends to be something that academics do a lot. So that synthetical exercise, kind of like doing the abstract for your PhD, get it down to short, little communication sound bites. And if you can train yourself to do that, you're going to be much, much more effective. So I'll just leave it at that.
You have a good point. And actually, and when you submit something for a job, please don't put footnotes and annotations, right? So let's open it up to questions. We now have 18 questions, which means by definition, we won't get through all of them. So let's see. I'm just going to go through here. So so the first question here is from Ann Taylor, who says, do you ever come across resistance to your PhD credentials or scholarly experience when trying to pursue non-academic professional work, i.e. People they stereotype you as ivory tower and not that you don't have a real world perspective. So this is a question to anyone.
Absolutely. I probably being a literature PhD more than I'm pretty sure the other two. Absolutely huge. And I'll quote something that was once said to me in an interview, and the person said, "Nothing that you've done has any value for me." Right. So you just kind of have to toughen up and be prepared for that kind of response. Right. A lot of it I've learned over the time is part of the kind of people testing you to see, how you handle that kind of stuff. But sure, people think you're disconnected from reality, you're abstract, you talk too long, all of these things. And I think you can reshape how you interact with people to compensate for some of these, negative perceptions. But I think the first one is an ego thing, which is you may have felt that you were on the top of the world, Yale PhD, and all of a sudden, you're there and somebody who got a BA from Amherst, gets a job, right? And you're like, wow, what's that about? So, and maybe Amherst is not fair, but you get the point. It's just you're not on top of the world, and you have to sort of adjust your own expectations to that.
Linshu or Levi, any comment on this question? The ivory tower versus real world bias?
I would say this is curveball. This is a hard one to answer. I personally think, life is never like a straight line, so you don't immediately see how you can get where you want to get to. So just get started, and dots are connected, and you never know where life will lead you to. Probably after 2 or 3 years, once you have some experience, open for you. Just don't hurry up. You have such a long runway, 40 years, blah. Just take your time and don't just pressure yourself to work. Don't kill yourself.
I mean, Peter, as you mentioned, biotech companies are often replete with PhDs. The vast majority of the people at our company, even though we're small, have PhDs. So that's not something that we encounter there. I have met people before who, in conversation, have sometimes made a point of saying, well, my PhD is not from Yale, but And you know, there's nothing that you can do about that kind of thing. Sometimes you just want to just make, if it's something on you and it's an EQ thing, like you mentioned, you know, focus on those soft skills. If you see it as coming up as a recurrent thing that people happen to find you abrasive, but it's just, you know, being relatable. But it's not, sometimes it's not something that you're doing.
The next question is a fun question. All right. So I'm going to be interested in how you answer it. So what advice or tips do you have for leveraging the PhD in non-academic job progression salary negotiations? So how do you use that PhD to get a bigger raise or a promotion? I picked this because it's kind of a fun question, right? Has it worked for the three of you?
So I have two answers. One is don't make the mistake that I made when somebody in a private equity company asked me, you know, if money was important to me, and I said, and I kind of dodged it, and I said, sure, but you know, a lot of things are important to me, and I didn't answer that the way that would have been best, right? I should have said, yes, it is, in that context, right? That would be EQ. The other is, I got a lot of opportunities that I don't think I would have gotten without the PhD. I think that, you know, that people see it, they recognize it, they admire it. They may have a little grudge against, you know, I have a PhD, but it's not from Yale. There's just some of that. That's just life. But I think that it will work in the long run, as Lin Shu says, in your favor, right? You just be true to yourself and patient with your trajectory, and it's going to help you a lot, I think. If you can, especially if you can soften down the negatives, you know.
But you know, the obvious, of course, is that any profession
some of your training and shaping.
Yeah, the obvious observation is there are some professions where PhD is a huge plus, like biotech, and obviously your problem is how do you get a raise if you don't have a PhD, right, in biotech research. But I think it's a good question for a lot of things, because I guess it probably varies quite a bit by what industry you go into, whether or not it really gives you leverage or not. Interesting question from Rachel Burgess, kind of an interesting question. In graduate school, there's of course a huge push all the time for publications. Are publications valuable if we're looking for careers outside academia, or should we really focus our energy on other experiences as part of getting the right job and the right career? This is to anyone on the panel.
I can probably start with that one. I think really like if you get to publish at the top journals like Nature or Science, it's a huge accomplishment no matter what, right? Everyone knows what Nature or Science is, and you know, knowing that getting there is super hard. So that's just a testament of how good you are. So if like if I were in your shoe, if I get an opportunity, I will always shoot for it, like 100%. And also I would just, you know, think about like if you are doing still like science related careers, like probably Levi can better comment on this because probably it's more common in biotech, but also in in quantum computing, you know, that is like super valued like within the community, and you know, like it just naturally attracts a lot of attention. Even if you want to start a startup, if you say like the idea comes out of a Nature paper, it just adds to the credibility a lot. So I would just say, first of all, it's always a testament of your capability. Second, if you're doing research related topics, it can be a great starting point.
I can pick up from there. So I've had the advantage of having been, you know, one of the first handful of people at Halda, getting to sit across the table from a lot of the people we've interviewed to bring on board as we've grown. And what I would say to that question is that since, as you mentioned, you know, there's a focus on publishing. But when you think about why that is, it's not only, you know, to push the field and to be doing something productive with your time, but that is the metric by which the quality of the work you have done is judged, right? So you're in a PhD now. Your goal is to be able to, no matter what you want to do with it, to have done it well. And the metric that's demonstrated by is your publications, what you've published and where you've published it. So on that base alone, I would say, yes, it's still important. I would think, no matter what you want to go to, because if somebody were to ask the very blunt question of were you successful in your PhD, right? That's what you would point to make that case. Extending off of that and making a more specific case for us in biotech, again, it comes back to that skill set, right? So if we're hiring you because you have a skill or an expertise in a specific area, your papers are what are going to give us a sense of how well you've done that. But at the same time, I've not read the papers from anybody's CV that I've interviewed. When you come in to interview, you do a chalk talk. You present a deck and some work that you've done, and we'll get a chance there to see your thought process, the data you've been able to generate, how you work through it, and then how you jump off from it to the next questions that most of us would have. So it's still important. What I would also say, though, is that if you wanted to develop an additional skill set, you simply just have to make the time to do it. So I was president of the Biomedical Careers Committee when I was at Yale, and we did a lot of programming for non-academic careers. And that was simply just took more time. You just have to make more time in the day, basically. You have to have enough time to still publish well. And if you're going to do something extra, if it's important enough, you'll make the time for it.
This next question actually, they comment about life sciences, but actually I can take the question and make it applicable to all the panelists. And we talk a lot about this issue of how you somehow see how you are connected with the other professions, right? Whether you talk to people, people are in it, so forth. But the other, of course, are internships, right? Which, depending upon what profession, internships are either a standard tool or like investment banking, you know, most investment banks have internships, and consulting, right, is probably another good example where, and in fact, the companies use it as a way to recruit, right? So can the three of you, because you all touch on different professions, really comment about that and just saying, what are the kind of professions where internships really are reliably available, but, you know, and what role do they have in terms of helping people understand the business, but also get jobs? So anyone, you know, any of the panelists can answer this question.
Yep. I can probably start again, like I think there's standardized internship opportunities for like investment banking, for consulting, or like even for the big tech firms like Google, like they recruit for in data scientist interns to do that all the time. And probably I would just comment a little bit on the unconventional ones. Like for example, before joining McKinsey for internship, I did an internship for a venture capital firm. The opportunity is super random. I hosted an event like this, and we invited a panelist who is you know, a venture capitalist, and later on he offered me the opportunity. So I would just say, you know, think about your interest and do some like activities around the interest, and then you know, you like if it's like. This touched actually on networking as well. You don't want to network when you need to. You want to network when you know, you have the interest and you start to have some activities around those things, and you naturally have the networking opportunities there. And down the line, you know, if you decide to pursue a career around your interest, then that networking like resources naturally become handy, right? You don't want to ask for help, you know, one day after you know someone. So just, you know, start planning early and around your interest is a really great way to create leads, I would say. Not necessarily opportunities, but leads towards opportunities. And another point I would just probably add is have a cohort of people who think along similar lines as you do, and just consult with each other.
Levi, I guess, is there a tradition of internships in the biopharma field, or is it less common?
Not for PhD candidates. Yeah, candidates we do, but time to generate data, and I would assume, or need to be generating data for your thesis to wrap that up. But as Lin Shu pointed to, doing things around that, right? So I had the opportunity to be a Yale Candid fellow during the second to last year of my time at Yale, and that was great. So Candid Partners is a venture capital firm, and over the course of a year, they taught us about how venture capital operates and how they think, and then on the other hand, we did diligence for them in various areas that would be valuable to them. So that not only lets you network, as Lenshu pointed out, it also lets you develop another skill set. And one really nice thing that I enjoyed probably the most of that was I focused on this very specific topic. Doing this fellowship allowed me to go back to thinking about all diseases and a lot of different ranging areas that I had seen develop in, but were interested in, but couldn't bring myself to spend the time reading a paper in that field when I found a tangential space.
So Levi, is it true though, if you're a graduate biotech student and you have a cure for coronavirus, that you probably can get an internship? So, by the way, you should. I think the other comment is.
I imagine your university is going to manage that one.
Yeah. One other comment though is you don't necessarily have to. You can create your own internship equivalent experiences. So, for example, if you want to work for a clinic that does surgery, it doesn't. If they don't have a internship program, you could still go to them and say, look. I don't necessarily have to be paid, but I'd like to spend the summer doing this or that with you, or during the academic career. It's amazing how many people will say yes if you have a well thought out idea, right? So you shouldn't necessarily assume that the only thing you're going to do is apply to existing internships, because you can create opportunities as well, right?
I think if you're going to try to do that, you really want to make sure that you're approaching them with value that you can bring. And to make sure you're showing them why they should take the time to create that opportunity for you.
Right. I was going to go in that direction. I think that if you can, like in business schools, they encourage people to go to companies with a project that will be of value to them. And why would they say no, really? I mean, somebody has to look at it and oversee it and so on. But, I'm going to do a marketing research on, X, or, if you're looking to acquire some sort of new software program, I will research that and give you a nice little report after, 3 weeks. You learn how to figure out what would be of value and propose something, and that will be your internship. And whether it's a startup or a larger company, I think that in today's environment, that kind of thinking is much more prevalent than it was, and has real value, and people recognize it. So, but the key is, what can I do to give value?
And they'll give you credit for taking initiative and being thoughtful. It could be even more valuable than a traditional internship. So the last question, because we're down to the last 2 minutes, is actually a good question, right? And that is, what does a PhD give you that a master's does not, if you're set on going into industry and not continuing in academia? Good question, right? Anyone on the panelists can answer this.
It sounds a little bit pointed, so I'll warm it up. Let me speak from my own experience. When I was doing my PharmD, I also did a master's degree in pharmaceutical sciences, and that was a thesis-based research master's degree. And what I see in myself in the difference of having gone and gotten a PhD and looking back at where I was when I finished those programs is I feel much more ready to take on topics that I have very little initial familiarity with, and to be able to dig in and get familiar with them, to identify what's important, what's reliable, and to see where those new opportunities and jumping off points into a new space might be than I did before I spent 6 years of trying to create new information and new understanding about, in my case, the biology of a topic area. So my own personal reflection is that's where I saw the most growth, was in a versatility, adaptability, and definitely when she pointed to perseverance was definitely a skill learned over the course of that. It is a long time
And it wasn't that you loved university food, right? So, Lin Shu?
No, I absolutely 100% with points from Levi. Like perseverance is a huge point. Like people typically underestimate it, and in the long run, they realize how important it is.
Yeah, and for me, it's independent thinking. I can't emphasize that enough. Is that what you are being trained and shaped to do, and to just think is normal, is to really answer a question well and thoroughly, and that is so valuable. And I just don't think you realize it until you go out into the world and you realize that most business is done without that. And people really add value when they go dig deep into what's really going on and come up with solutions that really make a difference.
So with that, we have reached the end of our hour. I want to say personally, I think this panel did a terrific job of really sort of providing insights to those people who are in graduate school or come out of graduate school or thinking about their careers. I want to thank all three of you. I think we'll all agree that we had a bit of diversity on the panel, which is actually very important to this process. So I want to thank all three of the panelists for your time and your comments. Also, to those of you who are on, first of all, I would encourage you to, if you want to watch any of the previous ones on different topics, on research, on medical devices, whatever it is, just go to yalecareerpanels.com. But also, if for whatever reason you want to contact us for whatever, a topic that you think we should cover or otherwise, just send us an email at yalecareerpanels@gmail.com. And some of our best ideas come from folks like you. So thank you very much. And again, it was being recorded and will be posted on the website in about 2 or 3 days. And we'll notify all of you who registered, because I'm sure you want to watch this 3 or 4 times, right?
Peter, Stephen Blum wanted to call attention to crosscampus.yale.edu.
I know, but we've run out of time. So thank you very much, everyone. And we want to thank us all. And thank you again to all the panelists.